You have probably spent years believing that your deepest transitions become difficult because you are too sensitive, too hesitant, or too withdrawn. You have watched other people move through change with visible confidence. They announce decisions, sever ties, begin new lives, and speak as though certainty arrived before action. You do something different. You retreat. You become quiet. You question motives that once seemed obvious. You lose interest in conversations that used to hold your attention. Then you accuse yourself of failing at change because your transformation does not look decisive from the outside. Carl Jung spent decades studying this exact mistake. He understood that the psyche does not always guide you forward through confidence, clarity, and outward momentum. Sometimes it leads you through obscurity. Sometimes it removes your appetite for the life you have known before revealing what must replace it. Sometimes it sends an ancient inner figure to guide you, not by giving you answers, but by making your old answers impossible to believe. The hidden archetype, guiding many introverts through their deepest transition, is the hermit, not the social failure, not the frightened recluse, not the person who hates humanity. The hermit is the archetypal figure who withdraws from collective noise so that an inner authority can become audible. This distinction matters because you may be interpreting an archetypal process as a personal defect. Your desire to be alone may not mean you are becoming incapable of connection. Your exhaustion around familiar people may not mean you have stopped caring. Your inability to explain what is happening may not mean nothing is happening. It may mean the personality you used to explain yourself is being dismantled before a deeper identity has found language. This is why the transition feels strangely private. Something in you knows that speaking too soon would reduce the experience into a story you no longer trust. You may try to describe it anyway. You tell someone you feel tired, lost, detached, or uncertain. The words sound weak the moment they leave your mouth. They fail to contain what is actually occurring. You are not merely tired. You are withdrawing psychological energy from a version of life that can no longer carry your development. Jung called this energy libido, not only in the sexual sense, but as the general force of psychic investment. You place this energy into roles, relationships, ambitions, identities, and beliefs. You animate them through attention. You maintain them through repetition. You experience them as meaningful because part of your life force has entered them. Then, a transition begins. The energy starts returning inward. Activities that once felt important become strangely empty. Approval loses some of its power. Obligations become heavier. Social performance becomes more difficult. You may still carry out the same routines, but something within you no longer arrives with you. This is the beginning of archetypal withdrawal. A person sits at a kitchen table after work. A message appears on the phone from a group that once felt essential. The thumb moves toward the screen, pauses, and lowers the phone without replying. The person remains in the quiet kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum, unable to explain why another cheerful evening suddenly feels unbearable. From the outside, this can look like avoidance. Psychologically, it may be a refusal to keep distributing energy to a life that has become internally false. The hermit archetype appears when collective participation has begun to interfere with inner development. It does not necessarily demand permanent isolation. It demands enough distance for you to discover which parts of your identity belong to you and which were assembled from expectation. That discovery is rarely comforting. You begin to notice how much of your personality was built relationally. You learned when to smile, when to agree, when to remain silent, and how much of yourself could safely appear. You developed an acceptable way of being seen. Jung called this social face the persona. The persona is not inherently false. You need it. It allows you to participate in society, fulfill responsibilities, and move between different environments. The problem begins when you mistake the persona for the whole of your identity. Then your adaptation becomes your prison. You may become known as dependable, calm, thoughtful, agreeable, intelligent, patient, or self-contained. These qualities may be genuine, yet the identity surrounding them can harden. People begin expecting a specific version of you, and you begin protecting that expectation because it secures belonging. The deepest transition often begins when the psyche can no longer tolerate the cost of maintaining that belonging. The hermit does not immediately tell you who you are beneath the persona. First, it reveals the strain of continuing to perform it. You notice irritation where you once felt duty. You feel fatigue before social events. You rehearse simple conversations because spontaneous honesty might expose too much. You become aware of how often you modify your reactions before anyone else can see them. This can produce shame. You may think you are becoming selfish, cold, or difficult, but the psyche is not asking you to become cruel. It is asking you to recognize the labor involved in being acceptable. One person arrives early to every family gathering and stays until the last cup is cleared. During one gathering, a relative asks for another favor in the familiar, casual tone. The person smiles automatically, says yes, and feels the stomach tighten before the sentence is finished. Later, alone in the car, both hands remain on the steering wheel long after the engine has stopped. What you are calling social exhaustion may be the body registering the cost of a persona that has exceeded its rightful function. The hermit appears because you cannot discover this cost while constantly responding to other people. Every social environment activates a pattern. You become someone in relation to someone else. Around one person, you become the listener. Around another, you become the competent one. Around another, you become the child who must not disappoint. These identities emerge so quickly that they feel natural. Solitude interrupts the activation. When no one is present to need, judge, admire, or misunderstand you, the relational personality begins to loosen. At first, this does not feel liberating. It can feel empty. You may sit alone and realize you do not know what you want when no one else is there to react. You may have free time and feel restless rather than free. You may reach for your phone, not from genuine interest, but because silence removes the mirrors that usually tell you who you are. This is one reason the hermit carries a lamp in symbolic imagery. The lamp does not illuminate the entire road. It lights only the next small area of darkness. The hermit archetype does not offer a complete identity. It teaches you to remain present when certainty has disappeared. Your deepest transition requires this limited light. If the entire future became visible at once, you would probably interpret it using the values of your old personality. You would turn transformation into another project, another performance, another method of securing approval. You would rush to name yourself before you had actually changed. The psyche protects the process by withholding clarity. Jung described individuation as the movement towards psychological wholeness. It is not self-improvement in the ordinary sense. It does not make the existing personality more efficient. It changes the center from which you live. The ego wants a map because a map preserves control. The self offers a lamp because development requires participation in the unknown. Someone opens a blank document late at night, intending to create a plan for a new life. Several headings are typed, rearranged, and deleted. After 20 minutes, the screen is closed. Instead of feeling productive, the person sits beside the dark window and admits quietly that none of the old goals feel alive anymore. What you interpret as a lack of direction may be the refusal of the deeper psyche to let yesterday's values design tomorrow's life. The introverted person often encounters this process with particular intensity because psychic energy naturally moves inward before it becomes outward expression. Jung did not use introversion as a synonym for shyness. He described it as an orientation in which the subject's inner response carries greater psychological weight than the object itself. You do not merely register what happens, you register what it means inside you. This can make transitions slower in appearance and deeper in effect. You may need to live with an experience privately before you know what you think about it. You may require distance before your real emotional response becomes clear. You may leave a conversation believing everything was fine, then realize hours later that something essential was violated. This delayed clarity is often misunderstood. Others may expect immediate answers. They ask what you want, whether you agree, how you feel, and what you plan to do next. Under pressure, you may offer the answer that produces the least friction. Only later does the true response rise. The hermit protects that true response from premature compromise. It creates an interior chamber where the unlived reaction can finish forming. A person listens quietly while a manager describes an opportunity that everyone else considers desirable. The person nods, asks sensible questions, and says it sounds promising. That evening, while placing a plate in the sink, the body suddenly becomes heavy. The word no appears inwardly, with more certainty than anything spoken during the meeting. What you call indecision may be the time your psyche needs to separate authentic choice from immediate adaptation. But withdrawal alone does not guarantee transformation. This is where the archetype becomes dangerous when misunderstood. You can imitate the hermit without entering the hermit's psychological task. You can isolate yourself while remaining completely governed by the collective. You can leave the room and spend the entire evening replaying what everyone thinks of you. You can avoid relationships while allowing imagined judgment to dominate every decision. Physical solitude is not the same as inner separation. The real withdrawal occurs when you begin removing unconscious authority from external voices. This is difficult because those voices may no longer sound external. They have entered your inner speech. You hear them as your own standards, your own fears, your own common sense. You tell yourself that changing direction would be irresponsible. You tell yourself that disappointing someone would be cruel. You tell yourself that your desires are unrealistic, your anger is immature, and your need for space is excessive. The sentences may belong to parents, teachers, partners, institutions, or communities, but they now speak in the first person. The hermit archetype guides you toward a more unsettling question. Who inside you is speaking? Jung understood that the psyche is not a single voice. It contains complexes, emotionally charged structures built from experience. A complex can temporarily take possession of your perception. When it activates, you do not simply have a fear. The fear begins interpreting reality for you. A rejection complex finds evidence that you are unwanted. A duty complex transforms every boundary into guilt. An inferiority complex turns another person's success into proof of your inadequacy. During a major transition, these complexes become louder because the old identity is losing stability. The ego reaches for familiar psychological authorities. It would rather obey an old wound than stand without instructions. This is why the transition can feel like an argument inside your own mind. One part of you knows that something must end. Another part produces every possible reason to preserve it. One part longs for silence. Another fills the silence with accusation. One part wants an honest life. Another warns that honesty will cost you love. The hermit does not eliminate these voices. It teaches you not to mistake volume for truth. A person writes a resignation email, saves it, and closes the laptop. 5 minutes later, the laptop opens again. The email is softened, then softened again, until the central truth disappears. The person reads the polite version, deletes it, and walks slowly into the next room without sending anything. What you experience as inner conflict is often the struggle between a developing authority and a complex that survived by keeping you compliant. The hidden guide within this transition is not asking you to become certain. It is asking you to become capable of hearing contradiction without immediately escaping it. That capacity is one of the deepest forms of psychological maturity. Most people try to resolve inner tension by choosing one side too quickly. They idealize freedom and deny attachment. They idealize loyalty and deny resentment. They call themselves independent while secretly longing to be chosen. They call themselves compassionate while secretly fearing conflict. Jung called the ability to hold opposing truths the transcendent function. This does not mean rising above human problems through spiritual detachment. It means allowing conscious and unconscious positions to remain in relationship long enough for a third possibility to emerge. You may love someone and know that the relationship can no longer continue in its current form. You may feel grateful for a life that has also become intolerable. You may need solitude and still ache for intimacy. You may know a decision is necessary and still grieve what it will destroy. The ego finds these contradictions unbearable because it wants moral simplicity. It wants one side to be right and the other to be wrong. Then action would feel clean. The psyche rarely develops through clean action. The hermit carries contradiction into the interior and refuses to falsify either side. Someone folds clothes into a suitcase, then removes them and places them back in the drawer. A framed photograph is picked up, wiped with a sleeve, and returned to the shelf. The person sits on the edge of the bed, neither leaving nor deciding to stay, finally allowing love and suffocation to exist in the same room. What you are calling confusion may be your first honest refusal to mutilate a complex truth for the comfort of certainty. As the transition deepens, the shadow becomes unavoidable. The shadow contains the qualities, impulses, needs, and emotional truths that your conscious identity cannot comfortably claim. It includes aggression in the person who must always be kind, dependence in the person who prides himself on self-sufficiency, ambition in the person who pretends not to care, tenderness in the person who survives through detachment. Your persona and shadow develop together. Every identity creates an opposite. The more firmly you become the responsible one, the more irresponsibility is driven underground. The more you become the peaceful one, the more anger accumulates outside conscious permission. The more you become the person who needs nothing, the more your unacknowledged need waits for expression. A deep transition weakens the persona's control. Shadow material rises. This can frighten you because your inner reactions no longer match your moral image of yourself. You feel anger toward people you love. You envy lives you claim not to want. You fantasize about abandoning responsibilities you once accepted willingly. You become less generous, less patient, and less available. You may conclude that the transition is corrupting you. Jung would ask you to examine whether the corruption was already present as unlived life. The shadow does not become dangerous because it contains unacceptable material. It becomes dangerous because the material operates without relationship to consciousness. Unacknowledged anger becomes passive cruelty. Unacknowledged need becomes manipulation. Unacknowledged ambition becomes bitter judgment. Unacknowledged grief becomes numbness. The hermit leads you away from witnesses because some truths cannot be admitted while you are still protecting your innocence. A person receives a message from a sibling asking for emotional support. The familiar reply is typed quickly. "Of course, call whenever you need me." Before sending it, the person notices a sudden surge of resentment. The phone is placed face down, and for the first time, the resentment is not covered with immediate kindness. What you fear is selfishness, may be the return of a need that was forced underground each time love required your disappearance. The transition becomes deeper when you discover that withdrawal is not only about escaping the demands of others, it is also about meeting the parts of yourself you used other people to avoid. This is the point where solitude loses its romance. At first, distance may bring relief. No one is interrupting you. No one is requiring an answer. No one is pulling you back into the familiar role. You feel cleaner, quieter, and more protected. Then the external noise fades enough for the internal noise to become audible. You encounter your own dependency on recognition. You notice how often you imagined explaining your transformation to an admiring audience. You recognize that some of your withdrawal was a silent punishment, a hope that others would finally understand your value through your absence. The hermit archetype exposes these hidden negotiations. It asks whether you truly want freedom or whether you want someone to chase you while you are leaving. It asks whether you truly want solitude or whether you want protection from being known imperfectly. It asks whether your silence is sacred or whether it is a weapon you refuse to admit you are using. These questions are painful because they remove the superiority of the wounded introvert. You may have constructed an identity around being deeper, more perceptive, or less superficial than the people around you. Perhaps this identity helped you survive environments where your inner life was ignored. Yet it can become another persona. Depth can become vanity. Sensitivity can become moral authority. Solitude can become concealed contempt. Jung repeatedly warned that identification with an archetype produces inflation. Instead of entering a relationship with the hermit, you become possessed by the image. You begin believing your isolation proves special insight. You dismiss ordinary people as unconscious. You treat your inability to connect as evidence of spiritual advancement. The archetype meant to guide you then becomes a defense against humility. One person declines invitation after invitation, telling others that superficial conversation is exhausting. At home, the person watches from the window as neighbors laugh together on the pavement. A message is opened, reread, and left unanswered, not because solitude feels meaningful, but because returning now would require admitting loneliness. What you call discernment can sometimes be fear, protecting itself with the language of depth. The true hermit does not withdraw because other people are beneath him. The true hermit withdraws because he can no longer hear what is essential while surrounded by borrowed meanings. This is a much humbler movement. It does not make you superior to the collective. It reveals how deeply the collective lives inside you. It shows you how your preferences were shaped, how your ambitions were inherited, and how your rebellions still orbit the authorities they oppose. Even your rejection of convention can remain conventionally determined. You may build an unconventional life, primarily to prove that those who doubted you were wrong. You may reject success because someone else defined it first. You may refuse commitment because commitment was demanded of you. In each case, the rejected authority still controls the direction of your movement. Opposition is not freedom. The hermit guides you beyond obedience and rebellion toward inner necessity. Inner necessity has a different feeling. It is rarely dramatic. It does not need to defeat anyone. It does not produce endless speeches explaining why your choice is justified. It feels quiet, costly, and increasingly impossible to betray. Jung associated individuation with the emergence of the self, the regulating center of the whole psyche. The self does not speak only through pleasant intuition. It also appears through symptoms, dreams, recurring conflicts, loss of energy, and circumstances that repeatedly expose the limits of your conscious position. Your transition may therefore feel less like receiving guidance and more like being deprived of alternatives. The work no longer satisfies you. The relationship no longer allows sleep. The social role becomes physically exhausting. The old ambition produces no vitality, even when success remains possible. You ask for a sign, but the sign may already be the disappearance of your ability to continue without division. Someone sits in a parked car outside the office each morning. The radio plays quietly. The building entrance remains visible through the windshield. Each day, the person waits a little longer before opening the door, not because the work is difficult, but because entering requires becoming someone who no longer feels entirely real. What you call a loss of motivation may be the self withdrawing consent from an identity the ego is still trying to preserve. Yet the self does not promise that following it will make your life easier. This is the most uncomfortable truth. Your deepest transition may require you to disappoint people who benefited from your previous form. It may require you to surrender an image of goodness built around availability. It may require you to lose recognition, status, predictability, or belonging. It may require you to become misunderstood without defending yourself successfully. You may have hoped that authentic change would eventually be validated by everyone who truly loves you. Sometimes it will not be. People do not only love your essence, they also form attachments to your patterns. They know where to find you emotionally. They know which role you will play. They know what you will tolerate and what you will provide. When you change, you disturb an entire relational system. The person who relied on your silence may call your honesty aggression. The person who relied on your rescue may call your boundary abandonment. The person who felt secure beside your uncertainty may call your confidence arrogance. The person who praised your selflessness may become uneasy when you develop a self. This does not automatically make them malicious. Systems resist change because change creates uncertainty. They may genuinely experience the loss of your old role as the loss of you. You will be tempted to return, not because the old identity fits, but because misunderstanding is painful. You may soften the truth until no one is threatened. You may delay the decision until circumstances make it for you. You may explain yourself repeatedly, hoping that perfect language will remove the cost. There is no perfect language that makes transformation painless for everyone involved. The hermit's lamp illuminates only what you must stop denying. It does not remove grief from the path. The deeper cost is not merely losing people, work, or identity. The deeper cost is losing your innocence about your own participation. You may have blamed others for never seeing you, while carefully hiding whatever might have altered their perception. You may have resented being used while repeatedly offering yourself before anyone had to ask. You may have complained that no one respected your boundaries while ensuring those boundaries remained invisible. This recognition can feel brutal. It removes the simple story in which the world prevented your authenticity. It reveals that part of you collaborated with the concealment, because concealment secured attachment. You were not only trapped, you were also protected. The persona protected you from rejection. The silence protected you from conflict. The overthinking protected you from irreversible choice. The isolation protected you from discovering whether genuine connection was possible. Now the protection has become confinement, but releasing it still feels like danger. This is the choice hidden beneath the transition. You must decide whether you want to remain recognizable or become real. The two may eventually meet again. They may not meet immediately. For a time, becoming real can make you less understandable. Your language changes before your relationships adjust. Your values shift before your circumstances follow. Your inner decision becomes firm before external evidence supports it. This is the lonely middle. The old identity is no longer inhabitable. The new life is not yet embodied. You are between forms. Jungian psychology treats this interval as psychologically significant. Transformation requires a symbolic death of the former attitude. The ego experiences this as loss because it cannot yet perceive the shape emerging from the unconscious. You may want to hurry through it. You may search for a new label, community, philosophy, or mission. You may try to replace the old persona with a more enlightened one. You may announce that you are healed, awakened, detached, or finally free. The hermit asks you to resist premature identity. It asks you to let the empty space remain empty long enough for something unmanufactured to enter. You do not need to prove that your withdrawal is justified. You do not need to turn solitude into a public identity. You do not need to explain every boundary in language that makes it agreeable. You do not need to produce a complete plan before honoring what has already become psychologically undeniable. You are allowed to stop performing clarity. You are allowed to say that something no longer fits before you know what will replace it. You are allowed to become less available while you learn the difference between generosity and self-erasure. You are allowed to hear disappointment without automatically treating it as evidence that you have done something wrong. This permission does not free you from responsibility. It gives you a more honest responsibility. You remain responsible for the consequences of your choices. You remain responsible for speaking without unnecessary cruelty. You remain responsible for examining whether your withdrawal is serving integration or merely protecting fear. But you are no longer responsible for preserving every relationship in the form that required your unconsciousness. The hermit does not guide you away from life. It guides you away from automatic participation so you can return by choice. That return may be quieter than you imagine. You may not emerge with a new personality. You may simply stop apologizing before stating a preference. You may leave when you are tired. You may answer after reflection instead of under pressure. You may allow someone to misunderstand you without performing emotional labor to control their interpretation. These changes look small. Psychologically, they represent a transfer of authority. You are no longer asking the collective to tell you whether your inner experience is legitimate. You are learning to consult it directly, question it honestly, and act from it without turning it into an absolute truth. This is not isolation. This is relationship with the self. The accusation that began your transition was that you were failing to move forward because you had withdrawn. Now you can see the opposite possibility. You withdrew because the version of you that knew how to move forward belonged to a life that was ending. The pause was not proof of weakness. It was the chamber in which borrowed direction lost its authority. The hidden archetype guiding you has never demanded that you disappear forever. It has asked you to enter the darkness without immediately filling it, to carry only enough light for the next honest step, and to return when your presence no longer requires your abandonment. Your deepest transition is not turning you into someone who needs no one. It is teaching you to meet others without leaving yourself behind. If this resonates, subscribe to The Waking Shadow, where you can explore Jung's psychology for those walking the individuation path. Watch the video on your screen now to understand what happens when your old identity begins to fall away.